Huh?
You're listening to Cryptid Clues, featuring your hosts, Taylor Field and Ruben Olson.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to another episode of Cryptid Clues, Campfire Clues. I am your host, Taylor. And before we get into our paranormal topic of discussion today, we're going to just do a couple of plugs. You can find us on our website, CryptidClues.ca. You can send us an email at cryptidclues@gmail.com if you want to say hi, share any stories or whatnot. And you can also find us on our social media channels, Twitter, YouTube, and Facebook. Additionally, we're also available on Patreon, where you get ad-free early episodes that drop there on that feed. A couple other things I want to shout out. Me and Ruben just interviewed Ron Moorhead. That was a fantastic interview talking about his past and his research and books that he's written as well. It was such a humbling experience to talk with him and get that opportunity, and highly recommend going back and listening to that episode. That's live on our main feeds. Me and Ruben have lately been diving a little bit more into Bigfoot and Sasquatch and just their connections to other aspects of this unknown realm, I guess you could say. Definitely we're checking those out on the main feed, but other than that, new episodes dropping every Monday and Friday, so check it out. Without further ado, however, let's get into some paranormal stuff. I thought to myself that there's a lot of prominent locations in British Columbia that are notably haunted, and it would be cool to kind of dive a little bit more into this paranormal. I've highlighted a little bit in the past some experiences, and I've had, again, some people join me for Encounters episodes talking about paranormal, and there's a lot going on there. So these were some notable locations that I wanted to highlight in case you're from another part of the world and you just didn't know. But the first location is called Waterfront Station in Vancouver. And again, these are all in British Columbia, and they're in the more prominent, two of these are in larger cities, I should say, but this is one of the more busier transit spots in Vancouver. It's also one of the city's most haunted buildings as well. So, multiple security guards and staff have been consistently reporting encounters with paranormal entities, including a woman in red wearing 1920s style clothing. There's also elderly women that have also been spotted sitting on benches in the main hall area. There's a security guard who is searching in the back of a basement storage room with a flashlight. Now, this is getting into an actual encounter here. Having found the room empty initially, he turned back toward the door. While he'd been facing the back wall, someone or something had rearranged the boxes and desks being stored in the room to now block him. So whatever it was didn't want him to get out, or was just pulling his leg a little bit. Another guard had an encounter with an older woman. However, this time, this guard was in an old kitchen. This is where basically food for the old Canadian Pacific Railway trains was being used to prepare for their food, essentially. And when he found himself face to face with this apparition, this is a more prominently known encounter. So this woman stared at him intently, then started to float toward him. And as the story goes, the guard panicked, ran away right away. And that's that. So you'd think. This wasn't the end of his encounter with this same woman. He began to dream of her consistently over multiple nights, then started to see her face in mirrors and windows. He got the urge to want to paint her, but he wasn't even an artist. So he brought this portrait to the old kitchen, left it in a spot where he'd seen the ghost, and it was never haunted again. Sort of like breaking the curse, I guess. Whatever this entity was that latched onto him, this stopped it. There is another tour guide that was approached by a man who works at the station. Basically told the group that the painting is still there in the basement kitchen and that management had tried to move it, but the person who brought the painting to another SkyTrain station started dreaming of the woman himself. So the portrait was brought straight back, and that was that. So if you want a little context, Skye train stations, say that 3 times real fast, are basically all kind of littered out throughout the parts of Vancouver, and it's just a quick, easy method of transportation, get from point A to point B. So that's what that is referring to in this day and age. Another apparition. So this was witnessed and believed to be the ghost of an individual called Hub Clark, who's a brakeman who once worked in the rail yard at the station. Clark was hopping between tracks one day in 1928 when he slipped and fell, knocking himself unconscious. So the initial unconsciousness, like, this is something, okay, he would have survived, would have been fine. But there was a passing train. This train decapitated the worker, and now this is when it's said that you can see his lantern flickering, and TransLink employees have reported seeing an actual headless man carrying a lantern. Absolutely tragic story if this is an actual real occurrence and not a spooky campfire tale. This area, however, of hauntings isn't just limited to this building. So directly adjacent to this station, there was a building that was used for miners, essentially. And a lady in white has been consistently reported, and oddly enough, only by men, on cold, wet nights, but again by multiple people. One of the concierges actually had first seen her during his first night shift alone. The woman was standing by a large window at the back of the building, looking out towards the water. When he went to approach her, he found himself all of a sudden frozen in place, couldn't move. He then realized that she was crying, but wasn't able to speak. Her sobbing got louder and more hysterical until it almost began to sound like a laughter. Then she was gone. Just vanished. But in place of where she was standing or hovering, there was a small puddle of water. This puddle became such a common occurrence that it actually warped part of the floor, and that crews had to come in to find an explanation for this water because it was causing damage, but they were unable to find anything. So those are some prominent ones that take place in this transit station in Vancouver, which absolutely terrifies me, and I really latched on to that last part there with the woman in white because ladies in white are prominently spotted all over the world and associated with different cultural backstories and cultural elements of what they can refer to. I know something kind of along those lines that I had Carl guest on the show was the Banshee Cries. You can listen back to that episode where he talks all about banshees and the history behind them. And in this case, though, women in white, like I said, they have many cultural meanings across the world, and it's fascinating, especially when one becomes a reoccurring prominent thing. This one being contingent on only men seeing her on rainy, wet nights. Very, very fascinating. Moving on from there, though, we're going to jump to the BC Penitentiary. Now, this is in New Westminster. This is one that really, it really got to me, and I'll have like a personal story I'm going to throw in at the end of this. But basically, British Columbia, this was a federal maximum security prison located in New Westminster. Now, the BC Penitentiary opened and operated for 102 years. From 1878 until it was decommissioned in 1980, it was the first federal penal institution west of Manitoba. So basically what they were trying to do was, after British Columbia joined Confederation in 1871, and with the population of Western Canada increasing, the need for a federal prison in Western Canada became very much required because there was just this issue being that the Transcontinental Railroad had not yet been constructed. So it made transporting prisoners long distances back east to other federal institutions very costly and very difficult, which again further warranted this need of a local prison. So that's the groundwork, basically. There was, from what I had found, only one execution that had ever been carried out at the BC Penitentiary. Before the abolition, gosh, my words are all over the map today, ladies and gentlemen. I apologize. Oh my gosh, I'm laughing at myself. Before I'm gonna reword how I wrote my notes. Before they abolish the death penalty in Canada, there we go, buy a lottery ticket today. Executions were carried out at a provincial prison rather than federal prisons. So an exception was made in this case, and the individual's name was Joseph Smith. He was age 24, and he was executed by hanging on January 31st, 1913. So Joseph and another inmate at the BC Penitentiary, Herman Wilson, were both involved in the killing of a guard during an escape attempt on October 5th, 1912. Wilson was injured during the attempt and died from his injuries before his trial. However, Smith was tried and convicted of murder. So, outside from that, the BC Penitentiary did have a few other major violent incidences in its early history. It did not experience its first riot until 1934. That was about its 56th year of operation, I believe. However, it began to experience exponentially more of these major incidences as the facility aged, became less suitable as a modern prison. Most of the BC Penitentiary's major violent incidents occurred in its final 10 years of operation in the 1970s. And during the 1970s, it was one of the most violent federal institutions in Canada. The worsening conditions and increasing number of violent incidents at the BC Penitentiary contributed to its decommissioning in 1980. So going through the history here, again, first riot took place in 1934. Another riot and hostage taking took place in 1963. We have another riot in 1973. And finally, well, I shouldn't say finally, continually, another riot and hostage taking in 1975, and then finally another riot and hostage taking place in 1976. So this was just brutal in those last few years of this operating penitentiary. There's a nice long gap, like 56 years from opening. That's impressive with nothing happening, but obviously that would have been a continuous downhill slope leading up to the 1934 riot, especially then after that, even though it is looking at around 29 years before the next one occurs. But that one escalated with a hostage taking, not just a riot. So you can imagine those 29 or so years were prominently not okay, probably pretty bad. And like I said, just going down. So how did they counter this? They definitely just didn't leave it as is, and you can't. You gotta inquire what's going on, which is what they did. The government had commissioned an inquiry to get basically to the bottom of this, determine the results of what was going on and what the cause of these riots were. Before I get into those deductions as to what follows, I'm just gonna jump to a quick ad break, and we'll be right back. And we're back. Prior to the riot, each of the 3 hostage takers had spent considerable time in solitary confinement. That can definitely mess people up. So the inmates were then released from solitary confinement into general population without adequate supervision. That's another very big issue thing, because these prisoners are just getting back out and may not be all mentally coherent and feel isolated, and could be very threatening. Deplorable conditions at the BC Penitentiary contributed to a high staff turnover. In 1974, the rate of turnover for correctional officers was 61.2%. That is insane for a turnover rate. I know a lot of businesses experience turnover rates these days, but usually when they do, they try to figure out what's going on before it gets to be 61.2%. That is absolutely atrocious. There's also a major backlog in training for correctional officers too. So again, that's going to lead to some problems here. Many staff who were on Many staff who were on duty when the riots started were not adequately experienced nor trained. Again, these are things that are all going to lead up to people leaving. If you can't deal with the situations, don't have the proper tools, you're feeding into this negative energy. And again, the negative energy that's already existent there, all of these new employees are going to want to get out of it. It's just going to be so unhealthy and taking a mental toll. The facilities were ancient, not suitable as a modern prison. Again, this contributed to an environment with a high potential for further incidences, as we saw in the last 10 years that this place operated. There was serious overcrowding. There was a major lack of cooperation and communication between staff. This was an interesting note. Poor control of knives in the kitchen. That is a big red flag. My God. I mean, what's more to be said about that? There was a lack of alarm systems in certain buildings as well. Again, this is something that was kind of built on they built an initial compound, and then over the years they kept adding more and more to it. So it wasn't all one and done in a swift fellow blow of the construction crews. No, it was all kind of added as the years progressed. The BC Penitentiary site also included a prison cemetery called Boot Hill, however. The remains of most inmates who died at the BC Penitentiary were claimed by their families. However, those that were not were buried at Boot Hill. All work relating to the cemetery, such as digging graves, site maintenance, and the construction of grave markers and coffins, was performed by the inmates. The remains of approximately 50 inmates are still buried there. However, during the cemetery's early years, records were not carefully taken or preserved and are unreliable. So I didn't highlight any specific sightings, even though there are some, and I definitely advise you to go take a look at it. But I wanted to just touch upon this because these locations are so heavy with human emotion and human atmosphere, just negative because of everything that's happened in these locations. This is something that I can't remember if I've ever mentioned on the show thus far, but me and my wife, we were driving and we were actually coming from the Vancouver area. And this is kind of a funny, humorous story. I was trying to get to IKEA and I ended up way off the track at a closed down former, basically a mentally ill hospital. And this, I tried to find the name. I couldn't find the name of it, and I want to go back there and learn a little bit more information about this place. But it was a pretty good sized property, and driving around, like, the buildings were kind of overtaken by the landscape again, and there was a little bit of an admin office, I think, that you could go and speak to someone who was just kind of, I guess, probably had a security guard on site. But it was a massive pathway, just driving in between all the different buildings and everything, and the amount of energy that hits you, and it's not like you have to be super receptive to these sorts of things, but you can feel that there is a large weight to the things that used to take place in these areas, and seeing the amount of hate that was manifested and excreted out of such a place like this. I just can't imagine that walking in these halls and in these rooms, you're going to feel that hate, and you're going to feel so heavy. And again, be careful that nothing latches onto you either. But the amount of negative vibes that are just protruding out from these different horrific acts that were just leading to more and more horrible things unfolding. I don't blame the turnover rate of correctional officers trying to get out of there. Undertrained, not prepared to deal with this, the mentality, and again, just the deaths. When you're living a rinse-repeat lifestyle and it goes right up to the day you die, I think that kind of cements a part of your spirit. And this is just parts of my mind that I'm discussing of my perspective here. This isn't factual by any means. But I do believe that a part of you living a rinse and repeat lifestyle will trap a part of your spirit behind if you aren't living your life and you don't execute your life in that peaceful way, or you don't achieve that goal that we are supposed to fulfill in each of our individual lives as human beings on this planet, on the spiritual journey that we're progressing forwards with. If you're trapped and negated from ever achieving that, your spirit will be broken, and it will be unhealthy, and it'll be just crushed and doomed to just live in this rinse repeat area for all time. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope it's just an alternate realm that's just explored by these spiritual beings that were just manifested of so much hate and negativity, and they're just exploring the unending realm. I don't know. That's just something that I kind of thought and pondered, but a very, very heavy location that I wanted to discuss. So moving forward from there, we got one last spot. This is in Kamloops, the Tranquil Sanatorium. Built in 1907 to treat tuberculosis, the British Columbia government bought the land specifically for the construction of the sanatorium. Prior, it was just a ranch beforehand. As the tuberculosis epidemic was spreading in the 1900s, a small community known as Tranquil was actually built around the sanatorium. It included gardens, houses, gyms, fire department, and a whole bunch more. So in 1958, eventually the hospital was to be closed down. That's not the end of it though. In 1959, they reopened it to treat the mentally ill. It permanently closed down in 1983, but briefly operated as a detention center for young offenders until the 1990s. It's now known as Tranquil Farm Fresh, so it's definitely still up there, and it is open. It offers terrifying escape rooms along with heritage tours. So they're still using it to try and feed the local legend and a little bit of the history of the area. Visitors that do go there often claim, though, to see a mother crying for her child on the 6th and 8th floors, while others have reported hearing the voices of kids playing in the children's ward or seeing bright orbs near the main entrance. There are multiple buildings at this site. Again, just like the previous one I mentioned, it was kind of more additions were constructed as time went on. And in some of these other buildings, they have mysterious tunnels that actually connect many of them underground. And again, these are where more reports come of voices and cries that are basically popping in and heard throughout all of these different tunnels. To my knowledge, I believe they open up the tunnels when they do some of their escape rooms around like Halloween time and everything like that, just to kind of like, get the aesthetic going. I don't know if I'd want to be caught dead in one of those tunnels. It sounds terrifying, but to each his own. And that is all the information I have, basically. I just thought it would be really cool to kind of touch upon a few little hauntings here and some prominent locations. There is a lot, and I mean a lot, of haunted locations throughout Canada and throughout British Columbia alone. So it's definitely going to be a topic of conversation in the future. And depending how things go, me and Ruben want to incorporate paranormal into our Bigfoot discussions. And just like how we, in our previous week's episode, we kind of incorporated the UFO and the Bigfoot phenomenon together. Paranormal and Bigfoot will be meshing in a future episode. That's for definite. But until then, you can find us. CryptidClues.ca is our website. Social media channels, CryptidClues@gmail.com if you want to say hi, send us an email. And then Patreon, early ad-free episodes. Mind you, be sure to check us out on the Patreon because we revised our tiers as a big thank you because March was our biggest month yet. And we put in a few new rewards, some physical rewards, and a little bit more digital content as well into our Patreon to try and spruce it up. But just as a way of saying thank you to all those that are supporting us. So until next time, stay safe and we'll see you soon.